Let's talk a little bit about fourth downs.
Yep.
How much meat is still on the bone, so to speak, when it comes to fourth downs? Are coaches going for it enough from an analytical perspective? Where is the efficiency to be had moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I remember, I started going to the Sloan conference, this Sloan Sports Analytics conference in 2012. And I remember by like 2014, I was so tired of fourth downs because that was the only thing with football. It was always obvious that was going to be kind of the first thing that got crossed off the list. It was the easiest from a math standpoint. You could pretty clearly define like, here's when they should be going forward or shouldn't, but nothing was really happening. Nothing was really changing. And so I felt like it was a conversation killer. It was a sign that there is no progress being made in football. So let's talk about another sport. And so I was so sick of talking about fourth downs. But then over the last 4 years, coaches have actually started to listen to the nerds a little bit, and they've made up a ton of ground. I had this in the piece, but yeah, like in 2017 in college football, teams went for it 60% of the time on 4th and 1. Overall. And of course that means it was like, whatever the split was, like 80% in opponent's territory and like 30% in your own, or whatever those numbers were. It's up to 74% now. 14, it jumped 7% in 18, and then it just kept right on rising in these recent years. At the pro level, they were only going for it 44% of the time in 2017, and that's up to 70%. They've almost caught college. So in that way, I mean, it's definitely not necessarily optimized, but it's getting a lot closer. Teams are going for it over 90% of the time in opponent's territory in college, which is nuts, considering where things were. There is still plenty of meat on the bone, so to speak. Number one, teams still don't really go for it all that much on the other side. There's like Mike McRoberts from Championship Analytics, who I talked to for the piece. He said there's like some mythical barrier at the 50-yard line. If it's like the opponent's 45, they're like, all right, we can do this. If it's your 45, they're like, I don't know, better play it safe. We better punt this. But there's still plenty of recommendations that they're not listening to in terms of going forward on fourth down in your own territory. And while the percentages are rising, there are still a lot of situations where the numbers very much say, 4th and 3, 4, 5, 6, you should be going for it. And that's getting better, but it's still not very far along. So, but the lowest hanging fruit is 4th and 1 and 4th and 2. And we're actually seeing those numbers match up a lot closer to how they should be than what we're used to seeing.
What's the barrier? What is the barrier? It's hard to paint an entire industry of more old-fashioned coach think and paint that brush widely, because every coach, every situation, every background is different.
Yeah.
But in the guys you've talked to, and notably you talked to Lane Kiffin, who, if there were ever somebody who would be more inclined to be a younger person who thinks like an older person, given his background, given his father, given like the coaches he's coached under, what is the thing that stands in the way of coaches giving themselves and their teams advantages?
You're still basically you're potentially signing up to lose quicker. And Lane Kiffin said this when I was talking to him. I've used this analogy too. It's like hitting on 16 in blackjack. There are certain specific cases where you're supposed to, like where the odds say it's the best play depending on what the dealer is showing and all that other stuff. But when it's time to actually say hit me, when you've got 16, you're like, no, I'll just go ahead and I'm done, and you lose. And so that's a huge part of it when there's actual money on the line. If you go for it and fail versus if you punt, and if you lose either way, you'll still catch much more crap if you went for it and failed than if you punted. And it just feels like the safer choice because it's going to get you yelled at less. And I think that is starting to turn, at least on 4th and 1 specifically. But that is always going to be the biggest part of it. Even if you know what the odds say, you also know how people will react, and it just feels like even if you go ahead and lose, by punting, you're stalling, you're holding off finding out if you're going to win or lose or not a little bit longer, and that still makes it feel like a safer play, even if the numbers say it's not.
Is that a way? Sorry to jump in. Is that a media thing too, though? Is that like an older fashioned football thinker?
Oh, yeah.
Typing like an older columnist who's saying they lost because they did this.
Right.
And then they have the attention of fans, right? It's not just a coach thing. It's an ear thing. It's an eye thing of who has the attention.
Yeah, and that was, I mean, the whole thing with the Chargers and Staley last year when they went for it and failed 3 times against the Chiefs. Like, they'd gone for it and gotten it a lot in other games, and it helped them win other games, and that just became part of the win. But when they lost to the Chiefs doing it, it became why they lost.
Right.
And so there is that, and you still hear it, not even necessarily with like the older announcers. You still hear any announcer basically like they're guaranteed to say like, oh, they're going to roll the dice here, they're going to go for it. When it turns from an odds perspective, punting is the risk. Punting would be risking it, not going for it.
Right.